Yeah, and I think that's all the little housekeeping items. So today we're talking about floodproofing and the differences between them when they're used, how compliance is verified, and so on. So we'll start with wet floodproofing. And so we have wet and dry. They're basically opposites of each other. So wet floodproofing is a technique that's used to prevent damage from flooding by allowing the floodwaters to enter the structure or the area. So to verify this, we need proper anchoring of the structure to prevent movement or collapse. We need to use flood damage resistant materials because we're building typically at grade below the base flood elevation. We protect mechanical and utility equipment by elevating that portion of it to or above the base flood elevation, and then the use of either flood openings or breakaway walls. And so breakaway walls are more coastal, I think. I don't recall them being used in Kansas, so we're mostly talking about flood openings in that case. So we use this for, again, things that we built at grade, which are limited to compliant enclosures that are underneath and are used to elevate residential and non-residential structures, and then for accessory structures that are low cost, low investment, that are used only for storage or parking, and agricultural structures that have been issued variances from the community. And that's to verify that those are also low damage potential, and we have to take a closer look at agricultural structures because they are very diverse. So we need to look at how they're being used and make sure that it's a safe choice for that building. So I just pulled this out of our model ordinance. It's just how we verify enclosures below the lowest floor. So this would be like a full story enclosure or a crawl space most commonly to elevate a residential structure, but also non-residential structures. So these are specific to the flood openings and what's required for that. So again, these enclosed areas can only be used for parking, storage, or building access. And this is not in relationship to any basement. We will talk about basement stuff for dry floodproofing, but that doesn't apply to wet floodproofing. So again, we're equalizing the pressure of the floodwaters by allowing them to enter and exit that area freely, and that relieves the pressure on the outside. Otherwise, you could have collapsed foundation walls, and that's structurally very damaging and very expensive. So that's why this is a requirement for those enclosed areas. And so we have these designs certified by a professional engineer or architect. So enclosures below the lowest floor, we're talking about either residential or non-residential structures. So that's a little bit different than what's required for the accessory and agricultural structures. So we'll go over that, but it's a minimum of 2 flood openings on 2 different walls. The net area needs to be at least 1 square inch per every square foot of enclosed space. That's subject to that flooding. And then the bottom of those openings shall be no higher than 1 foot above grade. And so I was just looking at things earlier. It could be either the exterior or the interior grade, whichever is higher. So there's a little caveat on that. And there's a technical bulletin that's just on flood openings, and that's Technical Bulletin 1 that was released in 2020. So if you would like to see more information about that, and I have some other publications that are relevant to this later on in the slides. And so they can also be equipped with screens or louvres, valves, but they have to be permanently disabled in the open position, or they're engineered openings that are designed to automatically open and close, so we can't have any human intervention needed for them to work. So yeah, and then that allows for the, again, automatic entry and exit of floodwaters. So I don't want to misconstrue this as wet floodproofing residential structures or anything like that. It's just the enclosures that are below them. So there was a little bit of confusion the last time we did this presentation, so I just wanted to point that out. And then I pulled this from our model ordinance as well. These are pertaining to the accessory structures and agricultural structures. So each of them start off with this paragraph, and then there's a listing underneath of the more specific requirements. So this isn't the only language that's required for these standards that we've added to the model ordinance. So they're now in the main body rather than the end optional higher standards, and that's just to help make sure that people have these adopted to regulate them better. And since FEMA clarified that we have to have variances for wet floodproofing the agricultural structures. So the accessory structure, again, it's only for parking or storage. It has to be at least or not larger than 600 square feet in size. It's not attached to any other structure on the site. It also has to be on the same parcel as the principal structure and incidental to the use of that structure. So there's no human habitation or occupancy of that structure. It's a single wall design, and it meets where it says the following requirements, so that's where those are listed. And I added the link to our NFIP resources page, so you can see our draft ordinance there if you want to see the full language that's required. And then agricultural structures are in connection with the production, harvesting, storage, drying, or raising of agricultural commodities, including livestock. And it may be constructed at grade and wet floodproofed if it's low damage potential. So obviously no human habitation or occupancy of that structure. It's a single wall design, and then the next requirement throws people off sometimes as preventing their structure from being agricultural, but there's no permanent retail, wholesale, or manufacturing use. So even the selling of produce and that kind of thing can prevent it from being considered an agricultural structure. No employment or entertainment uses in that type of structure either. And then it has to have the variance granted from the floodplain management requirements, which would otherwise be to elevate it at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, and then have that floodplain development permit issued as well. So enclosures below the base flood elevation. So this is just a sketch of a crawl space building. So you have that enclosure underneath the lowest floor, which would be the living floor. So underneath that, you have this open space where either the interior ground needs to be level or above the outside of that, because otherwise, if it was lower than the exterior grade, then FEMA would consider that a basement, which would be in violation and would have to be fixed somehow, brought into compliance. So just something to keep in mind there. So we have at least 2 flood openings on different sides, and they are no more than 1 foot above grade. Okay, so this is just another diagram, maybe a little bit more detail here. So again, flood damage resistant materials below the base flood elevation. You have the openings in the foundation wall. You can see how the floor framing is set up above that area. So this is just another visual for that. And this one's from the Homeowner's Guide to Retrofitting, if you wanted to look more into that. And it's really common for people to want to board these over or otherwise close them up, just because it can impact temperatures during the different seasons, or they're concerned that there will be animals or other things coming in through that area. So that's a good time to use the engineered openings that automatically open and close, which can also help with avoiding a retrofit. So if someone doesn't have enough openings to meet that 1-to-1 ratio of 1 square inch of opening per every square foot of enclosed space, it can help them avoid that, as long as they have enough that are rated. So engineered openings are rated for whatever capacity they can allow. So just another tip on that. So this would be a diagram 6 structure in the elevation certificate. So this is a partial enclosure underneath the living space, and so you have a full story enclosure there, but it's only partially under that structure. And again, that would have to be wet flood proofed, so equipped with the openings and then used only for parking, storage, or building access. So that can't be converted later on into living space, which is where a non-conversion agreement might be helpful for this type of enclosure. The same thing here. This is a full story enclosure. This is a diagram 7, so it's a full enclosure that encompasses the entirety of the living floor above it. So you can see that this is used as a garage, as garage doors. You can also see the flood openings on it and a high water line. So this building was submerged for like a month or two. This one's out of Missouri. And then once the flood waters receded, they were able to go back to the house with just minimal cleaning and repairs. And so that's why these enclosures are wet floodproofed. That way there's no damage sustained and the use is such that there's no concern for damage. It's, like I said, just minimal cleaning and repairs in there. And then the accessory structure. So another diagram. They're also called appurtenant structures. So not habitable, they have to be anchored to resist flotation. They have the flood openings. They're built of flood-resistant materials, 600 square feet or less, elevated utilities if there are any, or mechanical equipment, parking or storage, and we cannot modify that use in the future. As I said before, also on the same parcel of property as the principal structure. So these are probably the most common violations that we see when we do our audits. People will just pick these up from the store. Many of them are just pre-made and you just have them delivered and installed. And many of them are not compliant for floodplain use, so they don't have the vents or are meeting the other criteria to be allowed to be wet flood proofed. The size is another bigger issue that we see. They're often quite a bit larger than 600 square feet. So just something to be aware of, and watching out in your floodplain, just looking for these sheds because they tend to pop up pretty frequently. So we're looking at mostly a shed, for example, to store like lawn equipment, or a car garage is similar. So it's kind of the same rules as a detached garage, or even an attached garage. Those can also be wet flood proofed at grade and not elevated as long as they're used the same way here. So parking, storage, or building access. This might be a good graphic, or you could find another graphic that might be good to hand out to potential applicants with the permitting. So this is the type of structure that could be verified with just the permit, and it wouldn't need the variance or necessarily an elevation certificate if it doesn't have the mechanical equipment or utilities. When they do, we do have to verify that they're elevated high enough. So that would require either a surveyor or an engineer to document that. But otherwise, if it's just a very simple shed, we don't need all of that. So again, no commercial uses. We do run into that at times, as people will buy sheds and then want to use them as an office space or as a workshop for their business, and then that precludes it from being allowed to be wet floodproof. So you can't have those commercial uses in there. And this would be the alternative. So if you can't meet the requirements to wet floodproof at grade, then you would need to elevate it. Other things to look out for are buildings that are put together in this type of way. So it's not flood damage resistant materials. There's no flood openings. It's not anchored. And if you look closely, it's just kind of sitting on these pieces of wood. So again, not the right materials, not properly elevated, not vented, and it might also be a local code enforcement issue. So just other types of things to look out for when you find these accessory structures just popping up in the community. The same thing here with the materials, no elevation, no venting, not anchored. So again, some of these companies just, usually not like this, but they will just ship out the pre-made sheds. And so one thing you can do is send letters to those manufacturers, to those companies that you have in your community to let them know about the floodplain requirements, where you have floodplain in your community. And they may not do anything with that or change the way that they do things by just installing them anyways, but at least if an applicant comes to you, blaming that company for their violation, then you can at least say that they were informed about the rules. So agricultural structures, again, there's a lot of diversity when you say agricultural structures, so we have to look at what the use is. So typically we're looking at pole frame buildings, steel grain bins, frame corn cribs, or general feeding barns, or just like harvesting or growing produce, that kind of storage or use. The kind of things that we don't want to see wet flood-proofed have to do with livestock, animals, poultry houses, milking parlors, that kind of thing. Any sort of livestock operations, just because it could leach that waste into the floodwater, which is something we want to avoid. It could be dangerous for the animals. Any storage of harsh chemicals that might be used in agriculture is also something that should preclude it from being wet flood proofed. So again, anchored, needs to have flood proof materials or flood damage resistant materials. It would have the flood vents. We can count the open walls as an opening, so we just need another opening on a different wall. But if it's completely open on one side, that's fine. So the same thing for like garages and accessory structures, we can't count a door as a flood opening. It has to be permanently open or able to be opened by the floodwater. So we can't count a door. You can put an opening in a door, like a garage door. So again, agricultural structures, the production, harvesting, storage, drying, or raising of agricultural commodities. So technically the community could grant a variance for something to do with livestock. It's just discouraged. We would rather see something like that elevated. And so then no human habitation or occupancy, of course, single wall design. Again, no retail, wholesale, or manufacturing type of uses. And it's going to have to meet those requirements that I mentioned earlier that are listed out in the model ordinances that we have, and also have that floodplain development permit issued. So this is a good example. There are no size requirements for agricultural structures. They can be any size as long as they're meeting the ratio by having enough flood openings. So this one is built at grade. It's wet flood proofed. It's made of the right materials, presumably anchored and low damage potential. So FEMA has released over the last couple of years different guidance on how this is supposed to be done. So this policy was released in 2020. It clarifies the granting of variances that are needed for the agricultural structures. It supersedes the previous technical bulletins. Those bulletins have been updated since this policy came out. So there's new guidance in Technical Bulletin 1, which came out in 2020, and then the new Technical Bulletin 7 on wet floodproofing that came out in 2022. So yeah, I mentioned this already. Accessory structures are on the same parcel as the principal structures. So this is just a little bit more about the guidance on agricultural structures. I'll show you where I got this one. You might find some of this information in that policy that I just showed you. But I think this is from the FEMA publication 2040, so I'll show you that in a few slides. But if ag structures are repetitive loss structures, by the National Flood Insurance Act definition, they can be repaired. Other hazards, they have to meet elevation or dry floodproofing requirements, or wet floodproofing if it's approved. Then you would be restoring it just to its pre-damage condition. You would still need the permit and the variance. It's not eligible for disaster assistance. And so that's why we try to encourage the low investment. If it's not properly wet flood proofed, it would be ineligible for flood insurance. So the insurance agent is going to verify that information about it being wet flood proofed. And then something else we come across sometimes is KSA 12-758. So this exempts agricultural structures from most requirements in the state, either state or local. It does say except for floodplain regulations, though. So they do have to follow the floodplain regulations by getting the variance and all of that to be built at grade. So that law does not apply to floodplain regulations. So again, we are reducing the financial burden on applicants from requiring them to elevate as long as they can meet these requirements. So it would exclude things that are not buildings. So we're talking about walled and roofed structures. So not a holding pen or tanks and pools, aquaculture stuff, strictly just structures. So yeah, at least 2 rigid walls, secured roof. Examples of accessory structures are 2-car detached garage, carports that are walled and roofed, storage and tool sheds, small boat houses. Again, not for habitation, but there are other types of construction or development that we wouldn't consider to be a building, and so it wouldn't have any elevation requirements. Usually these just need a permit from the community, unless they're in the floodway where they would need the no-rise. So stuff like a gazebo, pavilions, picnic shelters, the types of carports that are open on all sides, fencing, that kind of stuff. So some communities do require a variance for accessory structures as well. You can find that language in our recommended higher standards section of the model ordinances, so that would be towards the end of that document. But we need some kind of mechanism of compliance, which is why we have these regulations that include standards for these types of structures. They have to meet the definitions that I explained. Again, it has to count as a structure, minimal investment, an ag structure that's low damage potential and isn't going to leach something into the floodwater or potentially cause an explosion or become debris. So it kind of follows the same rules for any other variance, except there's kind of this inherent caveat where if it's a low damage potential ag structure in the floodplain, then that would count as an exceptional hardship, that it's a minimal investment building, then we shouldn't require it to be elevated as long as it's secured and not going to be damaged, which is why we have the flood vents. So again, that's a requirement for those. We have the exclusive use requirements that can't be changed. And there is potentially you could get a community-wide exception for having the wet floodproofing without the variance. Basically, you would write a report to FEMA, kind of proving your topographic and velocity and other types of proof that the flooding conditions would allow for this to be appropriate in any area of the city as long as it's still permitted, or the community, that is. So we haven't really seen any examples of this. Basically, FEMA considers it extraordinary circumstances on your local condition, which would also include hardship, inequity, having that sufficient justification based on economics, environmental, hydraulic and hydrologic data that demonstrate the impact on the public safety and welfare. So that may include your flooding conditions, safety and access, your warning time. It seems like there's a lot that would go into this, but the FEMA regional office would inform you whether or not that was granted. So yeah, that is a possibility. Again, we haven't seen anyone apply for that yet, at least not in Kansas. So functionally dependent uses, this kind of goes back to variances a little bit more, but I just wanted to add this in here because it kind of comes up with wet floodproofing. So this is another exemption type of structure that have to be built on water to carry out its purpose. So docking facilities, shipbuilding and repair facilities, a dam, a marina, a port facility, that kind of thing. So they do have to have some kind of methods of protection that minimize the flood damage and any threats to public safety. So pretty much all the same things we've been talking about, the materials it's made of, elevating mechanical equipment, having offices that were elevated, circuit interrupters, having an emergency operations plan on how to move contents prior to a flood, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to point this out. It's kind of related in the way that it's exempt from those rules. These also get a variance. And we did have a case where we had a marina that was being built, but it was more of an entertainment type of like bar area where you could rent paddle boats and that kind of stuff, which doesn't really meet the NFIP definition of a functionally dependent use, which excludes most entertainment, wholesale, retail, that kind of stuff. And so this is where I pulled that previous information on ag structures getting rebuilt if they're repetitive loss and stuff like that. So this is the longer version of the 2020 policy that I showed you. There's definitions, examples, specific construction standards, how to combine wet and dry floodproofing techniques, development that's not technically structures, how to do the administrative variance, and that would be important to know. The type of structures that would pose a danger to the health and safety and welfare of the public. Again, repetitive loss situations. And there's more model language for ordinance amendments because FEMA highly recommends that you adopt that language into your ordinance if you're going to allow for that wet floodproofing and those types of variances. So that's kind of the gist of wet floodproofing. It's mostly the same for the different types of structures that you would be allowed to do that with. So dry floodproofing is pretty much exactly the opposite. We're keeping things watertight and substantially impermeable to the passage of floodwater. So this is very technical. It's difficult to achieve. It's only come up once recently. Usually when I start explaining these requirements, people just opt to elevate, and elevating is actually the preferred method over dry floodproofing. It's less likely to fail, and there's a lot that goes into this that people would have to do with the warning times and the emergency operations and the continued maintenance. So I will go through this. It might not come up in your community, but it is good to know about. So we have active and passive measures of implementing dry flood proofing. So each one of those components is really important to the design, and the entire design has to be certified by either an architect or an engineer. So this is important for mixed use buildings, so like a hotel that has residential areas and parts that are not residential. Only the non-residential parts can be dry flood proofed. So this is only for non-residential structures. There is some exemptions on that, and we'll get to that towards the end here. So the flood protection level, basically whatever your adopted freeboard is, because there's insurance considerations that you'll only get insurance credit if you have at least 1 foot of freeboard on the dry flood proofing protection level. So flood shield, this is a very common part of a dry flood proofing design, but also a common source of leakage and failure of that system. Yeah, so jumping down here to the end, the substantially impermeable part. So FEMA has been moving more towards building codes, so they've implemented that a lot more in the more recent dry flood proofing requirements. So ACE 24, which is the American Society for Civil Engineers, has these publications that have to be complied with and certified on the dry flood proofing certificate. So there's a whole other form to certify these types of designs, and they're more stringent than the NFIP minimums. So this is the Technical Bulletin 3 on dry flood proofing. It was updated in 2021. They tripled the length of this document. They've broken down the design process into 10 different steps. They have really focused on the insurance implications and the relationships between that and the design and planning. So there's just a better explanation of the relationship between each of these elements. They really upped the technical references. Like I said, you have to comply with ACE 24, ACE 7 for the flood loads, and there are other references to technical bulletins and other publications. So again, it has to adhere to at least the ACE standards, or ASCE. I don't know if people call it ACE, but that's the standard of practice at this point. And that's written into the flood proofing certificate that the engineer or the architect signs off and certifies on. So again, it goes back to their promotion of building codes. You'll find that section in pretty much all of their new technical publications. So obviously, wet versus dry, very different. So I feel like it's kind of a misnomer to call them both floodproofing. But floodproofing is designed as is defined as a combination of adjustments or additions of features to buildings that eliminate or reduce the potential for flood damage. So it's just two very different approaches to that. Again, wet floodproofing allows water into that enclosure or structure. Dry floodproofing uses these different elements to make a building and attendant utilities and equipment watertight and impermeable to flood water. So those components have to have the capacity to resist the flood loads. So for that, you need the floodplain development permit from the community, an elevation certificate, and a floodproofing certificate. Although the floodproofing certificate does have an elevation section in it, so we will look at that. But to determine if you can even do this to an existing building, you would have to really look at all of the different existing characteristics. So assess the architectural and structural systems, the building envelope, what the utility systems are like, and assess what the vulnerability points are and how it will perform under flood conditions. So you have to have all of those calculations. You have to look at the flood warning time, any functional use requirements, safety, and access before, during, and after the flooding conditions. So that is going to play an integral role on whether you can even do the dry flood proofing or if it's just going to need to be elevated. So it has to comply with those design requirements, reduce the damage below the protection level, provide safe and responsible deployment of active measures. So those are the ones that have to have the human intervention to be deployed before a flood. The feasible implementation, maintenance, and operations. So there's 2 required plans that go into this. And then a level of residual risk that's acceptable to the owner, because there's always some leftover risk when you implement this. It's possible that the system could fail, and then you would have unexpected higher losses. And how much would your insurance policy offset that? So again, active measures require the human interaction. Passive measures, no human interaction is required for that. So that would depend on the flood warning time. That's going to impact the design, whether those active measures are feasible and would come into play for the operations plan. So you could have a larger flood than you're expecting, so a higher water level, longer inundation for some reason. The systems can fail, so you'd want to consider what the functional use is of that structure and how, again, the risk would be offset. So failure can be due to unidentified points of entry, poorly maintained measures, insufficient resistance to the flood loads, or failure to implement the active measures. So there's a lot of places where this could go wrong. Examples and explanation of these types of measures. So just commonly reinforcing the building, having watertight doors and windows, those flood shields that I mentioned, paints and membranes that conceal seepage or cracking. Sump pumps are a required part of the design. Having backflow valves, backup power sources, I believe that's also required for the sump pump, and window glazing, also called aquarium glass. So all of that and the flood loads and any possible debris impacts from other things in the floodwater. As I mentioned, you need 2 required plans. You have emergency operations and inspection and maintenance. So you should require the submission of these plans if anyone proposes to do the dry flood proofing, and you could add that to your regulations later on. You could do an amendment if this is something that starts coming up, and those are required to get the insurance credits and receive the that eligibility. So basically, you'd have to do inspections annually, make sure anything that needs to be repaired or replaced is done. So before there's flooding, you would adjust your operations after an event and evaluate how well those worked out. You could also require a third party to do a review of those plans. And so this is all the requirements for the emergency operation plans. So we don't need to go through all of this. I just wanted to give you the full list and show you everything that's required. So you can see why a lot of engineering goes into this. It's expensive, and it's likely going to be more expensive and resource consuming than just elevating a new structure or an existing structure. Excuse me. So yeah, this is the inspection and maintenance plan requirements. So this is periodically going through and making sure everything works. Your people know where everything is located, how to operate the equipment to get it deployed properly. And yeah, just make sure everything's working and that the maintenance plan is actually maintaining everything that you would need during a flood. So there's a lot of companies that sell these different products. You can find them just by looking for flood equipment or flood proofing. There is a rating or approval by like the International Code Council. Some of them are like code compliant with the ACE 24 publication, so they do make quality products that should work if they're used appropriately. So they're kind of like FEMA approved equipment that have been, pre-calculated and all of that. They also can provide training on the installation. They also added a section to this technical bulletin on why floodproofing has failed in the past. It's kind of a lessons learned section. So the biggest contributors to flood damage on dry floodproofing is a lack of plans that were detailed on installation requirements, insufficient details for maintenance. New people will buy a building and not even know that this system is in place and then unintentionally alter it. Missing damaged or degraded equipment that wasn't properly maintained. Modification by contractors that are doing other types of maintenance. So that's why the required plans are pretty critical to having this be effective. If they're deficient, then the entire system is deficient. So we have seen in the past change of ownership causing the issues. Or the base flood elevation could change in the future. Flooding conditions will change in the future. So there's a lot of different variables to try to plan ahead for. And then this is what the new form looks like. So just like the elevation certificate, it will expire at the end of June in 2026. You have the basic FEMA statements here, the purpose of the certificates to certify the design. So this is what it looks like. So you have your basic building information, you have the mapping information, and then the design information. So right above the certification, it says that it's going to comply with the standard practice of ACE 24 or their equivalent if there were adopted building codes that met those requirements. And then there's some pretty detailed instructions on all that required documentation. So just real quick here, as we're getting closer to the end, the residential basement exemption. So basements are something that come up a lot in Kansas. People want to build them in the floodplain pretty frequently, or even expand existing ones frequently. So FEMA did at some point way in the past start this residential basement exemption program. So we only have 10 communities in the state that are part of this program, and many of them don't allow basements anymore because they ran into a lot of issues with violations, and you have to be accepted into this program, and then you have special standards that are adopted into your ordinance. And so I've kind of listed those requirements out. So again, you're approved to participate in that program. It has to be low velocity, lots of warning time. The basement is really just like 5 feet below the exterior grade. So it's technically a basement, but not like a true basement. Floodproof to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Have the top of the floor of any basement area no lower than 5 feet, right? Adequate fill surrounding the building. And then it also has to have a design that's certified by an engineer or an architect. Watertight walls, utilities that are impermeable, capable of withstanding the flood loads on the building. That includes buoyancy. Minimal damage to occur above the floodproof design level. And then this is inspected by the community official to verify that. So again, we only have a few communities that have done this, and it has led to a lot of issues. So I don't see many more being admitted to the program, but people will sometimes just find the residential floodproofing certificate and then just use it without knowing that the community has to be part of the exemption program beforehand. We've also seen them use the regular dry floodproofing certificate, so they weren't following all those rules that were specific to just the other ones, because there's no standards for basements in the regular dry floodproofing certificate, so that becomes an issue. This is also an issue with Lomar Fs, or the letter of map revision based on fill. Communities have applicants that want to build a basement into the fill pad that they then remove from the floodplain. So that's something common that you might come across. And then this is the residential basement floodproofing certificate. This one expires in 2024. It basically outlines all those requirements that I went over. Just the property owner's information, and then all of this information about how it's flood-proofed, the elevation of the floor, the HAG and lag, and all of that. So that's what that looks like. Not likely to come across this as a situation. But it is important, I guess, if it comes up, especially when people get confused about the different forms, and then may inadvertently build something out of compliance. Also with this, flooding is common. Again, dry floodproofing has a high rate of failures. So, and then it's not really worth it if people are kind of building a sunken living room. It's just putting a lot of risk to that building for not much payoff. So yeah. There is, again, the discount as we're under the new pricing methodology with flood insurance. So if it's a residential building where FEMA has approved that basement floodproofing premium discount, and they're in one of these zones, so in the floodplain with a base flood elevation, that's part of the eligibility requirements. And then non-residential buildings, any zone but a V zone, which is the high hazard coastal area, so we don't have to worry about that, or in any participating NFIP community. So yeah, this probably won't come up much, but the discount will depend on that level of floodproofing. They have to submit all of that documentation with their applicant or application to get the discount, and then FEMA evaluates their eligibility, and they work with the insurance carrier. So again, few of these structures are in the approved communities. And changes to the map can take away the eligibility if a community has withdrawn or they no longer qualify for it because their risk has increased. So they are really looking at what the risk is to the structure, and if that's increased, they might not qualify for it. Or if you're just in one area of the community that has now increased risk, you would not continue to qualify for that. There are other types of insurance discounts available though. And then another important point that we like to educate floodplain managers and property owners about is just unaccredited floodproofing. You can install these measures to help protect your structure. So even though it's not going to help with the insurance, it's not going to take you out of the floodplain, but it will increase the safety and reduce risk. So concrete flood walls are an example of that. Having a backflow valve in your house, in your plumbing, having an earthen berm, although we have seen that trap water against the structure. If it's placed appropriately, that might help. And then having that sump pump for the internal drainage. So the only type of flood control projects that actually do help with that are certified levees. So those have to be certified and meet the federal requirements for that. And this is something that's commonly misunderstood that I hear from property owners all the time, that this would be the same as that. It's not. This won't actually take you out of the floodplain or remove the mandatory purchase requirement. So just a quick wrap up, the wet and dry floodproofing basically have the opposite goals, those tactics to reduce the potential risk. Again, the different documentation, the wet floodproofing is usually just part of an elevation certificate or the permit itself, depending on what it is. And then of course, dry has its own certificate. The complexity is way different. Obviously, wet floodproofing is pretty straightforward, whereas dry is very complicated, very engineering and design heavy with all the detailed plans. Failure rate, wet should not fail unless it's built out of compliance or just a massive flood is the cause of that. Dry floodproofing, obviously there's a high failure rate if you have one flaw in that design. So there's no standards for a non-residential dry floodproof basement that are specific to the basement. So dry floodproof non-residential buildings can have basements if they are meeting those design requirements. The applicability, non-residential buildings for dry floodproofing, or we're talking about enclosures, accessory, or agricultural structures for the wet floodproofing. And then, of course, those technical bulletins that I showed you and FEMA, the publication 2040. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I saved about 9 or 10 minutes for any questions. And then I think Tara has a poll question.
Yes, I will bring that up. And I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you guys have questions, feel free to come off mute or put them in the chat now. And the poll question is just if you want continuing education credits for this training.
Yep, and then I will get those sent out to you as soon as I can.
Okay, most people have answered the poll. Give that just a few more seconds here. And then we will be posting the recording of this training on our training website as well.
And then any other questions that come up, just let me know.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks.